Hi there, I'm Alanna Carlson. I'm a lawyer and consultant and educator based in Saskatchewan. And today I'm going to be talking to you about various models of disability that have been in use for over 2,000 years. Just let me get started with my slides. I'd like to offer a special welcome to the guests of the Inclusion Saskatchewan conference. Okay, so I've got my slides here. I've got about 24 of them, and that might seem like a big number, but we'll get through them. So I'm going to be talking about what the past disability models are and what they tell us about where we are now and our future. So first I'll introduce myself. I'm, um, like I said, located here in Saskatchewan. I used to be a human rights lawyer and investigator at the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, and now I operate my own solo legal practice and do workplace consulting as well. I also do executive coaching for professionals, and I'm really interested in this work because I am a chronic illness survivor and I identify as neurodivergent and sometimes use the term ADHD or autistic and ADHD to describe myself. I'm also a regenerative farmer. My husband and I have some farmland where we grow crops, and I mill flour and bake and love to garden as well. So we're going to be going over what is a disability model and review the history of 10 models that have been in use in the common or modern era and where are we now. But before we begin, I would like to offer a sensitivity warning because I'm going to be talking about various views of disability, and some of them are what I would describe as deeply harmful or regressive, and others are inspirational and hopeful. But I would encourage you to, if you want to listen, to resource yourself in the ways that you like to do. Um, you're welcome to fidget, move around, focus on your breath, doodle, whatever you need to do to feel well. I would also like to um, indicate that I use identity first language rather than person first. So that means saying things like a disabled person rather than a person with a disability. And that's my preference for language. I often describe myself as a neurodivergent woman, and that's because I feel neutral and positive about my identity, and I feel that that kind of language reflects that. But this is just my choice and no judgment on how you prefer to refer to yourself. Okay, so this is about 10 models that we're going to be looking at. And I know it might look overwhelming, but we're going to go through it one by one. And I'm kind of going to go in a chronological order. So because I'm a lawyer, we love chronology of events. So I'll try my best with that. But um, to be frank, these models have overlapped and existed at the same time as other ones, right? So it's not like one ends and another begins. Like ones that started thousands of years ago, such as the moral model, still exist today in some areas, right? Um, so there's a lot of overlap, and I'll just show you a graphic here. This is a graphic from York University, and it shows that those overlaps that happen between the different models. First, what is a disability model? Well, they can be used to further define disability, to understand it, and the impact of the disability on the individual person, and then how that is seen in context in society. And these these viewpoints or the dominant narratives of disability have changed over time as societies and our views have changed. So we'll be looking at those changes over time. And I'll start with a more broad Indigenous view of disability. So there isn't like one model of Indigenous disability to review, but when you look at Indigenous teachings, they tend to refer to strength-based holistic models that see disability not as an individual deficit or failing, and often Indigenous languages don't really have a word for disability, but they look at health and wholeness through connections to the land, relationships, and community belonging. So there's an idea that all individuals have unique gifts and purpose in a community. Like for instance, you might have heard stories about how autistic people, perhaps 2,000 years ago or more, would have been treated as like shamans or medicine people or teachers or community guardians within a more Indigenous model. So then when we shift out of that, we see that disability or deficits essentially become a colonial construct. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from Greek and Judeo-Christian religious teachings. So this model that we'll go through is the moral and religious model. And in it, disability is interpreted as a divine punishment for sin or a moral failing or for spiritual unworthiness, either at the individual level or something the family has done. And there were some cases where a disability was reframed as a divine blessing or a sign of spirituality, and sometimes those people became saints, but that's a real exception and not very common. So in this model, the response was spiritual remediation, so prayer, repentance, sacrifice, or going on pilgrimages. So this model was used to justify a lot of violence and murder, a lot of harm, and it was reinforced by religious authority. And then it also shaped more modern responses to disability through charity and like institutions that controlled disabled people. So with each of these models, I'll go through what I'm going to call praises and critiques. So some praises, if you can call it that, for this model was that it provided some disabled people with specific roles in a society, such as prophets or being objects of religious veneration or beggars, and created a more of a social obligation to help those in need. But like I said, there was a lot of harm and violence with seeing people as deficient and requiring spiritual correction, which denies people autonomy and sovereignty, of course, and creates a lot of shame and stigma and social exclusion. So the next model that became more common is the medical or biomedical model. So this was coming up through like the 17 and 1800s, where the disability was seen as a pathological condition located within the body or the mind of the individual and requiring a correction. So that meant medical diagnosis, treatment, cure, rehab, all aimed at making the person normal, right? So in this model, medical professionals have authority over a disabled person's health and life outcomes, essentially, and disability is seen as something to be fixed. So this was really tied to the start of the Industrial Revolution, which created a significant tie to able-bodied labor, and those who weren't were considered unfit in society, right? So in terms of praises, this model helped standardize diagnoses and treatment, which has improved quality of life and access to healthcare for disabled people. It's been useful for health research and planning at the community level, for governments, for clinicians, for employers. But as for critiques, it treats disabled people as having deficits and places the power in medical professionals' hands and denies self-determination and autonomy to the individual. So the next model that we see is the charity model, and this became more prominent in the 1700s, but it had existed before then, of course, and exists until today. And in this model, disability is seen as some kind of like personal tragedy where a person is an object of pity and deserving of compassion and assistance from a non-disabled person or society. And what this does is that this model sort of elevates the non-disabled person as being this generous giver or helper and more moral or like a better person. And so the charity is more about the giver's social benefit or spiritual benefit rather than the recipient. And this has led to, or has been connected to institutional care, fundraising, and welfare programs. So we saw like charity and giving really tied to religious institutions, and over the past couple hundred years, there's been a real increase in charitable organizations, and now, like in the past 100 years, we have more uh, fundraising campaigns or things like the telethons and marketing campaigns to raise money. So this has provided, in terms of praises, this has provided resources and support to people with disability who had no other options, right? And that has been in the form of schools and hospitals and workshops and like day-to-day living. But as for critiques, it really promotes this view that disabled people are like helpless and don't have agency and dignity because of that positioning of like the non-disabled giver as the more moral person or the better person. And so it doesn't look at any, like critically look at any of the structures or oppressions that are happening in relation to disability. So then we have the disability, or sorry, the economic model. And we see this starting with the Industrial Revolution, of course, where the ability to produce labor um, was seen as like the way of being valuable in society. So disability is defined primarily by a person's ability or inability to participate in productive paid labor. And it did help create the welfare state. And what I mean by that is things like disability benefits and workers' compensation benefits, which have been very helpful for a lot of us. But the main critiques of it are that it defines a person by what they can do or cannot do, and their economic productivity, which doesn't account for other, relational or social aspects of life. Next, I'll look at the social model of disability. A lot of you will be very familiar with this one. It's quite commonly known and more modern. So it has origins in around the 1970s and 80s, with a lot of scholars and writers publishing texts and articles promoting this viewpoint. And it's a different viewpoint where disability is seen as not about the impairment itself, but by the social or structural, environmental, and attitudinal barriers that society creates around people with disability or impairments. So the solution lies in removing those physical, social, and attitudinal barriers. And this is seen as society's responsibility, not the individual's. So this model was very influential in relation to policy and legal changes, especially in the UK and Canada and the US, because it influenced rights-based advocacy and collective action and change. But in terms of critiques, the main one is that this look at impairment and disability being or a shift away from impairment and disability to a look at the conditions that society creates tends to ignore like the lived reality, the bodily reality that disabled people might experience related to pain or fatigue or chronic conditions, right? And especially invisible conditions or conditions related to gender. It looks like I missed the biopsychosocial model slide, so I'll just briefly touch on that one. So this one, again, became more popular in the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and it's a continuation of the social model, but it's looking at bio, psycho, and social. So that means the body, bio, what's happening inside the body, psychological factors, our thoughts, our emotions, our behaviors, and then our social factors, so the environment, our relationships, community, stigmas. So it's more holistic, where it's not just based on the individual, it's not just based on society, it's got a multitude of factors. And this is quite tied to some publications and documents that came out of the WHO at the time. Some of you might remember the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health document that came out in 2001. And it was really based on this biopsychosocial model. And this model became quite common and well used in healthcare, rehabs, research, and um, but in practice, um, there is a risk that this model sort of becomes a way to weaponize or to blame individuals for their reasonable responses to oppression, to be seen as like psychological deficits. So, for instance, like having a trauma response to being oppressed um, could be seen within this model as one of the psychological deficits of being disabled, right? So, um, you could see why there has been a shift from this model as well. Okay, so then another one that is common in this era is the human rights model. A lot of you will be familiar with human rights legislation that started coming up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s in various jurisdictions in the UK, in Canada, in the US. Things are sort of happening all around the same time related to that. And it's quite connected to the UN. There was the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that was adopted in the 2000s. And this document has been like signed on or like ratified by a lot of countries, but how it's actually being implemented, it's very different everywhere. Some countries, the document itself didn't have a comprehensive definition of disability. So some countries have interpreted it narrowly, some more broadly. And in our case, we have our federal legislation and also our provincial legislation. Provincially, we rely on the Saskatchewan Human Rights Code to protect human rights, including disability, and to enforce them and investigate and litigate. So this system, in terms of benefits, it created a legal obligation to promote, protect, and ensure the legal rights of disabled people. But on the flip side, it sort of means that it's become more bureaucratic and has evolved into a complaints-based system where someone's legal rights are enforceable primarily through making complaints to formal bodies, investigative bodies, or bureaucracy, which can be very taxing on an individual to do for themselves, especially when they're already disabled, right? So another model that we can look at is the social political model. This is sometimes described as the minority model as well. And this came up more around like the 90s and 2000s. And in this model, disability is understood as a political category, not neutral, but understood in relation to power, political power, in relation to race, gender, sexuality, and class. So these different identities that could be described as protected grounds or as types of identities and also oppressions. So in this model, it's very similar to the social model, but viewing it through a political lens. And the biggest part of that that I notice is the race and gender lens. So in terms of praises, this model has preserved the social model's critique of structures, but then this model includes more emphasis on individual impairments and the intersecting identities. But because it's more theoretical, it's hard to apply in policy and like frontline service delivery. So it's seen more as a framework. Okay, next we have the affirmation model or identity model. And in this model, disability and impairment are seen as positive or neutral aspects of life and lived experience, not just like tolerated facts of life. So instead of there being this idea of a personal or moral tragedy, it sees that disabled people can and do live lives and experience fullness, meaningful lives, and beneficial relations, not despite their impairments, but because of the impairments and disabilities as well. So this is related to the disability pride movement. You'll see the flag here. I've got one on my water bottle. And this model saw a lot more popularity in the 2000s and has been helpful in healthcare, social work, education to kind of shift the framework and to center the disabled person's experience and their value and their identity instead of deficits, right? But in terms of critiques, this model does have a risk of sounding a bit like positive thinking that kind of distract from that structural critique of systems and also the lived experience of pain and fatigue while being disabled. Next, I'll go over the diversity model. The most common version of this is the not the most common, but the most widely talked about version of this is the neurodiversity model or neurodiversity theories. So in this model, disability is seen as natural human variation. And the viewpoint is that diversity of disability must be recognized politically and socially. And so that means that society is encouraged to adapt to disability to increase accessibility and inclusion for those who have disabilities. So in the neurodiversity paradigm, it's usually how it's referred to, neurological differences such as autism or ADHD or bipolar, Down syndrome are seen as natural variations in human neurology and genetics, not deficits or disorders requiring correction. This graphic here on the side is a visual that an educator created that puts the medical model names of things under this neurodivergent umbrella. So this is recognizing language that started being discussed on online message boards in the 90s. Um, Autism rights activists started using this word neurodivergent to respond to them, sorry, to describe themselves in response to society's neuronormative standards, right? So this idea of neurodivergent is that a brain diverges from what is considered normal in society. And the reason um, that we have this language is because of this neurodiversity movement, which uh, takes the position that there really is no such thing as a normal brain, and that there's all sorts of different neurotypes or types of brains. So in terms of praises, this system, or sorry, this model has kind of challenged that pathologizing language and assumptions about disability and a focus on treatment, and instead aims to normalize the human experience of diversity in our human population. So it's resulted in a lot of good advocacy, community building, and political organizing, especially online. But in terms of critiques, um, the model doesn't apply very smoothly to all sorts of different disabilities. Some people don't feel welcome or properly reflected in this model, especially if they have significant physical or cognitive disabilities or high support needs. There's a lot of infighting in this community, especially when it comes to language use and how it interacts with the medical model. So what we see is that there's a risk of kind of diluting this understanding into focusing on neurodivergent traits as like superpowers um, that are related to like high employability and high functioning, um, while kind of ignoring a more broad experience. But um, every person that discusses or engages with the diversity model or neurodiversity paradigm might describe this differently. So it's hard to have a universal experience, but it makes it very interesting to study. So I'd like to take a moment to have you turn to the person beside you and reflect on this. So maybe take a moment to reflect for yourself first. Which of these 10 models that we went through that you resonate with the most? Maybe you prefer a combination of models, and I'll show them here on the screen. And I encourage you to discuss it with the person next to you as well. If I was in the room, I would ask you to raise your hands and tell me which of you respond most to each of these models. because I'm not there. I'm going to assume that most of you would fall in like the latter kind of six. Those tend to be the most commonly used ones today: the social model, biopsychosocial, human rights, sociopolitical, affirmation, and diversity model. So I hope this gives you something to discuss with your table mates or your colleagues. And now I'm going to take some time to go over some more modern theories and paradigms. So what we see is this is kind of in the disability studies discourse. So I'm not a disability studies scholar. Some of you in the room probably are and know a lot more about this than I do. But I would just briefly say that disability models and disability theories are two different things. And what we see now is quite a few different disability theories that are getting more common and popular and discussed and kind of overlapping and being used in conjunction with the models. So the first one I'll describe is critical disability studies. So this started emerging in the 90s through academic work and publications. And this theory questions the categories of disability and impairment and asks how these categories were constructed, who made them, in whose interest did they make them, who does it benefit? And it sort of criticizes the social model for not going far enough, and it challenges those binaries related to like impairment and disability versus at the individual level versus the social level. And this theory is more focused on intersectional feminism and using a lot of different viewpoints. So because of that, it can be tricky to use for policy change or frontline advocacy. And it's more of a broader viewpoint, or broader way of looking at things. Sort of similar is in that way is crip theory. It also started to emerge more in the 90s, and this theory questions the idea of able-bodiedness as a societal norm, and then seeks to reclaim crip as a political and cultural position in a more neutral or positive way. So similar to how the queer community reclaimed the term queer that historically was pretty negative or pejorative, crip has been reclaimed as this representative and political term that's used to interrogate how disability shows up in media, in literature, in society, in law, in politics. So it's a pretty rich way of analyzing disability and how it's constructed and seen in everyday life. Next, we have the disability justice framework. And this framework centers intersectionality. which means that disability cannot be understood in isolation from race, gender, class, or sexuality, um, immigration status, or other areas of identity and oppression. And so there's this movement towards like cross-cultural or cross-movement solidarity. So for disability communities, people of color, disabled trans people, um, people living in poverty, to kind of come together to organize and have a political and social um, source of power. Like I said, it's quite based intersectionality. There's some other principles. There's a lot of discussion regarding anti-capitalism, solidarity, and liberation, and interdependence. And with that is things like mutual aid organizations or mutual aid movements where people with different types of oppression are supporting one another, either through time or money. So it's a very comprehensive framework as well, and it centers the voices of those who tend to be most marginalized in society. Um, but again, it is hard to translate into like specific policy considerations. And then another thing that I'll say for each of these theories is that they're quite North American centered. So most of the publications and discussions are in the English language and focus on, especially in the US, focus on like societal structures and like social politics and policy that are unique to North America. But again, I'm sure, there's lots of people in the room that would have different viewpoints of these theories, and I welcome that discussion. If you want some more sources for reading, I have a blog about disability justice on my website, and then one about the neurodiversity paradigm as well. Okay, so where are we going now? What trends do we see? So I'd like you to take a moment to think about these 10 models and where you see the trend going. So for me, I see that there's, at least with younger folks and folks that are chronically online, there's quite a push and interaction with the affirmation model and the diversity models. These tend to be the ones that I see discussed the most. And you can really see how these models have, how we've come to arrive at these models. And it's almost like a return back to the original model that I discussed, the Indigenous model. This identity model where we're looking at disability as neutral or positive part of our identity, the diversity model where disability is considered a natural part of human variance. It's fairly similar to what the Indigenous model was emphasizing as well, which is those capacities, gifts, and roles that every person has in relation to each other and our community. So the way that I see it, at least, these two models are interacting quite a bit with the disability justice framework as well. And I see that those three things kind of work together to address the identities and oppressions that influence disabled people's lives. And I see that there's a lot of room for um, social and political and legal change with those understandings. So the one area that I work in quite a bit is in workplaces, and I do a lot of education on the diversity model or the neurodiversity model and how that relates to neuro inclusion and belonging at work. And there's quite a lot of interest in this area, um, specifically because um, of that understanding that there isn't such thing as a normal brain or a normal body. Um, like, for instance, medical professionals study textbooks, but surgeons that do operations understand that once you are working with someone's body, it looks nothing like what they study in the textbook, right? Similar for the brain. No two brains are the exact same. There is no such thing as a brain that looks or operates exactly like it would in a textbook. And a lot of people understand that and relate to that and are curious about um, ways of understanding that difference in functionality and um, how to use that in a safe and supportive way at work. So I'll just leave a moment here for you to discuss with your table partners what trends you see in relation to models, theories, and where we're going. I know you'll want to get on to lunch, so I won't take too long. My last point that I want to bring up is the local implication regarding our provincial legislation. So as many of you will know, in 2024, the Saskatchewan government passed the Accessible Saskatchewan Act. Some of you might have been involved with that or on the committees in relation to it. And I'll just share the definition of disability. So this act says that a disability is any impairment that in interaction with a barrier hinders an individual's full and equal participation in society and includes a physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory impairment, and a functional limitation, whether permanent, temporary, episodic in nature, or evident or not. Okay, so now that we've reviewed 10 models of disability, and we're looking at this definition of disability, this is the most modern definition of disability that's used in Saskatchewan. So you'll notice I bolded some things just for the sake of our discussion. You'll notice that it uses some wording that we have seen in the various models. So impairment, limitation, and interaction with a barrier, and hindering an individual's full and equal participation in society. So I'm seeing quite a lot of emphasis on social factors, right? So we've got barrier, participation in society. So to me, that relates to the social model. And I bet you recognize that as well. You've probably got some more going off you're noticing. So I'm noticing the language like impairment and limitation is related to the medical model. And you'll notice that this definition has an and. It's not an or. So this is my lawyer brain showing up to the table here. And what this means is that in order for there to be like a finding of disability, you need to have an impairment in one of these areas and a limitation in function. But it's very clear here that it could be permanent, temporary, episodic, or evident or not, which means like visible or not. So this does account for invisible disabilities. So it's quite a broad and inclusive definition, which is fairly similar to the one in the Human Rights Code for the province as well, although that one's a bit more prescriptive. So we see that this definition straddles various models that we looked at. And you can make an argument that it intersects with the economic model, the biopsychosocial, or other ones. So I find this very interesting that it's a combination of several. And something I always like to ask people to reflect upon is whether they see themselves in this definition. If you're currently disabled, does this definition meet your understanding of disability? Do you feel included in it? Does it cooperate with your preferred model of disability? Or if you're not currently disabled, I'd like to invite you to consider that disability is one of the identities that all of us will enter one day if we're lucky enough to age. And with age often comes physical and cognitive changes. It's very, very common, not that a lot of people currently recognize these changes as disabilities. I think there's still a lot of societal stigma and lack of understanding of what disability is, depending on your experience or a generation or whatnot. But I'd like you to consider what this definition means for you as a person who ages. If you enter into disability, what kind of protections would you need? As some of you will know, the Accessible Saskatchewan Act requires the government of Saskatchewan to create accessibility standards for government services and then to enact those accessibility options. So with an aging population, And with age coming more disability, I think this invites a lot of opportunity for discussion and consideration of how that will look in our future. Okay, I know you want to get on to your next uh, meal, so I'll end early. And I just have some recommended books here that I'll quickly mention that some of this is based on. So The Politics of Disablement is by Mike Oliver, and he's considered one of the grandfathers or godfathers of the social disability model. A History of Disability is a book from 2019 by Henri Jacques Stryker. And Illness, Politics, and Hashtag Activism is a book from 2024 by Lisa Diedrich. These are all interesting reads, and I invite you to consider what we discussed today and take some opportunities to discuss it with the people around you and your colleagues. And please, I would love to hear from you. You could find me on my website at alannacarlson.ca or online at alanna.carlson.consulting on Instagram or Facebook. And I'm also on LinkedIn, and you can reach out there as well. So thank you so much for having me be part of your conference today. I so much appreciate it, and I hope to hear from you soon. Thank you.